Scarlett Hayes grabbed the microphone out of Davis Park's hand mid-sentence, turned to face the ballroom, and raised her champagne glass toward the empty chair at table 1. The chair with Evelyn Sterling's name on it, and said, loud enough for every person in that room to hear, "To the woman who couldn't show her face tonight, to the wife who lost." She laughed. Victor laughed. A few nervous guests laughed because powerful people were laughing. But at that exact moment, the back doors of the Imperial Crown Ballroom opened, and the woman Scarlett had just toasted, calm, dressed in black, already shaking hands with a federal investigator, walked in. If this is your first time here, welcome. Please subscribe to our channel and hit that bell so you never miss a story like this one. And drop a comment right now telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The night started the way most disasters do. Beautifully. The Imperial Crown Ballroom on the 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower had been dressed in white orchids and gold light for the Silver Crest Gala, one of New York City's most anticipated charity events of the year. 700 guests, black tie, open bar, and enough money in that single room to fund a small country for a decade. But nobody was really there for the charity. They were there because Victor Sterling was going to make an announcement, and everyone in New York's social circle already knew what it was. Victor Sterling, 61 years old, salt and pepper hair, the kind of jaw that looked like it had been carved from confidence, had spent the last 18 months doing something that the wealthy of this city rarely did openly. He had humiliated his wife. Not quietly, not with the polite fiction of growing apart. He had done it loudly, visibly, with the particular cruelty of a man who no longer feared consequences. His wife, Evelyn Sterling, had stood beside him for 23 years. She had raised their 2 children while he built his empire. She had hosted his dinners, charmed his investors, smiled at his rivals, and buried 3 of her mother's hospitalizations in silence because Victor needed her composed and presentable at a conference in Dubai. And in return, Victor Sterling had introduced Scarlett Hayes to the world at a company retreat in the Hamptons 14 months ago, posted a photograph of the 2 of them on his personal Instagram, and told his publicist, not Evelyn, that a separation announcement was coming. Evelyn had found out the way most people find out about the end of their marriage, through someone else. A mutual friend had texted her a screenshot of that photograph at 7:14 in the morning. Evelyn had been sitting at the kitchen table in their Manhattan penthouse, drinking her first cup of coffee, wearing a robe she had owned for 9 years, when her phone lit up. She stared at it for exactly 4 seconds. Then she set the phone face down on the table, finished her coffee, and walked upstairs to shower. She did not cry. She did not call anyone. She sat under the hot water for a very long time, and when she came out, something behind her eyes had changed. That was 14 months ago. Tonight was something else entirely. Victor arrived at the Silver Crest Gala at 8:17 with Scarlett on his arm, and the effect was precisely what he had engineered. Heads turned. Conversations paused. The kind of silence that isn't quiet at all. It's just noise rearranging itself. Scarlett Hayes was 26 years old, and she wore her youth the way some people wear jewelry. Conspicuously. The crimson gown she had chosen plunged at the back and gathered at the floor, and she walked with the practiced ease of someone who had studied how powerful women enter rooms, and then decided she would simply be more of it. More color, more skin, more certainty. "You look incredible," Victor murmured to her as the maitre d' led them to the front table. "I know," she said, and she wasn't being coy. She meant it as a statement of fact. Around them, the room absorbed their entrance and immediately resumed its business, the way water closes over a stone. But the whispers were there, They are always there. Margaret Holloway, 72, one of the original founding members of the Sterling Foundation's board, leaned toward her husband and said without moving her lips, "He brought her here, to this event. That man has no shame." Her husband, who had done business with Victor for 15 years, said nothing and drank his wine. At the bar, two younger socialites were less discreet. "She's beautiful, you have to admit it," said one, a woman named Chelsea, whose family money was old and whose opinions were newer. "Beautiful doesn't mean right," said her companion. "That's his wife's event. Evelyn built this gala from nothing. She's the one who called in every favor, every donor, every—" "Evelyn isn't here," Chelsea said, glancing around. "Maybe she just didn't come. Or maybe she's smarter than all of us and stayed home." Neither of them was correct, but they didn't know that yet. Victor Sterling settled into his seat at the center table, the one positioned directly facing the stage, and he surveyed the room the way a man surveys something he believes he owns. His eyes moved table by table. Who was here? Who mattered? Who owed him something? And when he found what he was looking for, his expression settled into something warm and practiced. "$5 million in pledges before we even sit down," he said to the man beside him, a developer named Harrison Crane. "This city loves us, Harry." Harrison Crane smiled carefully. He had learned to smile carefully around Victor Sterling. "It's a good night," he said. Scarlett was already working the room in her own way. She was not a stupid woman. This is important to understand. Scarlett Hayes had a degree in finance from Georgetown, had spent 4 years at a wealth management firm before she entered Victor's orbit, and she knew how to read a room. What she had not yet learned, what her 26 years had not yet taught her, was the difference between reading a room and understanding it. She could see the surface of things, the smiles, the body language, the way people turned toward Victor like planets around a sun. She could not yet see what was underneath. She could not see, for instance, the way Margaret Holloway watched her with something that was not simply distaste, but calculation. She could not see how board member after board member seemed to be having quiet, pointed conversations at the edges of the room. She could not see the 3 journalists seated at table 14 who were not on the original guest list. She saw none of it. What she saw was that she had arrived on the arm of the most powerful man in the room, and the room was watching, and that felt like winning. "Victor," she said, sliding back into her seat and pressing her lips near his ear. "Who is the woman in the silver dress? 3rd table from the left. She keeps looking at you." Victor glanced over. "Angela Chen, head of the finance committee for the foundation. Don't worry about her." "She doesn't look happy." "Angela never looks happy. It's her personality." Scarlett accepted this and reached for her champagne. What she didn't know, what Victor himself did not know, was that Angela Chen had received a phone call 9 days ago. A carefully worded, precisely timed phone call from a woman whose voice was calm and whose offer was clear. Angela had listened. She had asked 2 questions. She had said she would think about it. And then she had spent 4 days reviewing documents that had been sent to her encrypted inbox. And on the 5th day, she had called back and said, "I'm in." The gala opened with a string quartet and a welcome from the evening's host, a news anchor named Davis Park, whose smile was as reliable as a television signal. He made jokes. He thanked sponsors. He talked about the Sterling Foundation's work with children's literacy programs and urban development initiatives across 3 boroughs. Victor Sterling sat at the center of it all with the satisfaction of a man being celebrated. Scarlett smiled beside him, her hand on his arm, and she thought, "This is my life now." And then, at 8:53, precisely when Davis Park was transitioning to the first course announcement, the main doors of the ballroom opened. Not with drama, not with fanfare, They simply opened the way doors open when someone chooses the moment carefully. The string quartet didn't stop. The lights didn't change. Davis Park continued his sentence about the canapes. But the room felt it. The way you feel a change in pressure before a storm. Something atmospheric. Something in the air. Evelyn Sterling walked in. She was 49 years old, and she wore a midnight black couture gown that had no embellishment, no drama, no excess. It was a dress that understood its wearer completely. Her hair was pulled back. Her posture was the kind that could not be taught in finishing school. It comes from somewhere deeper, from a woman who has decided, completely and without reservation, exactly who she is. She didn't look at Victor's table. She didn't look for Scarlett. She walked directly to Margaret Holloway, who stood to embrace her, and the two women exchanged a quiet word that made Margaret's expression shift from watchful to something very close to relief. Chelsea, at her table, grabbed her companion's wrist. Is that Evelyn?" "Oh, God," her companion whispered. Victor Sterling's peripheral vision was excellent. He had trained himself over decades of boardrooms and negotiations to notice everything at the edges of his vision without appearing to notice. And so he saw Evelyn without turning his head, and for just one moment, just one fraction of a second, his jaw tightened. Then he reached for his champagne and said to Harrison Crane, "She's not going to make a scene. That's not who she is." Harrison Crane said nothing. Scarlett had noticed too. Her hand on Victor's arm became, almost imperceptibly, a grip. "She's here," she said, and her voice was flat. "I can see that." "Why is she here? Did you know she was coming?" "No." "Did you invite her?" "Scarlett." "Victor, did you—" "No," he said, and the word had an edge to it, a warning. He did not look at her when he said it. Scarlett sat back in her chair and turned her attention back to the front of the room, but her eyes were no longer soft. They were working. She watched Evelyn move through the space, and what Evelyn did was not what Scarlett expected. She did not make eye contact with Victor. She did not approach him. She did not cry or confront, or even glance in their direction. What she did instead was work the room with a precision that would have been extraordinary in a woman trying to network at a business conference. It was doubly extraordinary in a woman who, by every account, had spent the past 14 months in retreat. She spoke to Angela Chen for 4 minutes. She spoke to the 3 men from Orenbach Capital, who had been Victor's longest-standing investors, for 6 minutes. She took a folded piece of paper from a senior man at table 7, Thomas Reeves, the foundation's legal counsel, and she tucked it into her small black clutch without reading it. She greeted the journalist at table 14 by name. By name. Scarlett's champagne glass was still in her hand when she turned to Victor and said quietly, "She knows that journalist." Victor looked. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes moved. Old friends, probably. Evelyn has always been social. That's not... Scarlett stopped herself, started again. She isn't moving like someone who came to watch. She's moving like someone who came to work. Victor looked at her then. Something about the way she said it, the perception in it, the clarity, made him study her for a moment. Then he said, with the confidence of a man who has never been truly caught off guard in a room he controls, "She's making one last attempt to look relevant. That's all this is. Let her have her moment." Scarlett wanted to believe him. She picked up her champagne again. She smiled at the woman across the table, who was looking at her a second too long. Inside her chest, something that felt uncomfortably like anxiety was beginning to build. At the far side of the room, Evelyn Sterling accepted a glass of sparkling water from a server and stood beside a pillar. And for a moment, Just a moment. She allowed herself to feel the weight of the evening. 23 years, this ballroom, this foundation. She had personally called 87 donors in the first year to keep it solvent. She had redesigned the Gala format after the second year because the original format was bleeding money. She had built relationships with every board member in this room over the course of 2 decades, and she had done it not out of ambition, or not only out of ambition, but because she believed in the work. Because children who couldn't read were real. Because community development was real. Because some things mattered beyond the marble lobbies and the champagne budgets of the world she had been living in. And Victor had taken it. He had taken the foundation, taken the board, taken her name from the letterhead, and handed it, all of it, to a woman who had never made a single cold call for a literacy program in her life. Evelyn took a sip of her water. She thought, not for much longer. The evening progressed. The courses came and went. Victor Sterling shook hands and received compliments, and said the things that men like him learned to say. Generous, resonant things that cost nothing and sound like everything. Scarlett was attentive and strategic beside him, and she was good at it. And Victor noticed, and some part of him was proud of her, the way you can be proud of a tool that performs exactly as designed. But the room kept doing something that neither of them could quite correct. It kept orienting itself toward Evelyn, not dramatically, not in any way that could be pointed to directly, but in the small calibrations of a social ecosystem. Who moved toward whom? Whose conversation ended when Evelyn approached? Whose phone went away when she was speaking? The gravity in the room had shifted, and gravity is invisible until you're falling. At 9:20, a board member named Robert Park walked past Victor's table without stopping. This was unusual. Robert had been Victor's ally on the board for 11 years. Victor watched him cross the room toward Evelyn and bend his head toward hers in quiet conversation. And for the first time that evening, Victor Sterling felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel. Uncertain. "Harry," he said quietly. Harrison Crane looked up. "What is going on with the board tonight? They're all gravitating toward her." Harrison was quiet for a moment. Then, "Victor, I got a call last week from Angela Chen's office. She said there was going to be an agenda item tonight that wasn't on the official program." Victor turned to look at him. "What kind of agenda item?" "She didn't say specifically. She said it was a matter of foundation governance." The silence between them stretched. Scarlett, who had been pretending to listen to the woman beside her, was in fact listening to every word. "That's not possible," Victor said. "I approve all agenda items for this event. It's in my chairman contract." "I know that. So it's not possible." Harrison looked at him. "Victor," he said, and his voice had the careful quality of a man choosing words precisely. "I think you should go speak to Angela. Right now. Before the speech." Victor looked at Angela Chen across the room. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the stage. "After the speech," Victor said. "I'm giving the keynote in 20 minutes. This is not the time to—" "Victor," Harrison's voice dropped. "I think it is exactly the time." Victor studied his old friend's face. Harrison Crane was not an alarmist. He was not emotional. He was a man built for stability the same way a bridge is built for weight. Victor pushed back his chair. "Watch her," he said to Scarlett, and she knew he meant Evelyn, without his having to say the name. "Watch her do what?" Scarlett said. But Victor was already walking. He crossed the room toward Angela Chen, and he was halfway there when his phone buzzed in his breast pocket. He took it out without breaking stride. It was a text from his lawyer. 3 words. "Call me immediately." Victor stopped walking. People flowed around him like water around a stone. He stood in the middle of the ballroom and read those 3 words again, and the noise of 700 people and the string quartet and the clink of crystal glasses seemed to get very far away. He looked up. Evelyn Sterling was standing 40 feet away, and for the first time all evening, she was looking directly at him. She didn't smile. She didn't move. She just looked at him with eyes that had 23 years in them, and something else, something new, something he had never seen in her face before. And Victor Sterling felt the floor beneath him do something he had not experienced in 30 years of building his empire. It shifted, just slightly, just enough. He put his phone back in his pocket. He changed direction. He walked not toward Angela Chen, not toward the exit, not toward his table. He walked toward Evelyn. And as he walked, he passed table 14, and the journalist, the one Scarlett had noticed, the one who had been called by name, looked up from her notes and made brief, polite eye contact with him. Her name was Dana Whitfield. She was an investigative journalist for the Times. She had spent 6 months on a story that was going to run in 72 hours, regardless of what happened tonight. But that would be, she felt certain, considerably more interesting after tonight. She watched Victor Sterling walk toward his estranged wife. She uncapped her pen. "Evelyn?" Victor said when he reached her. His voice was controlled, professional. The voice he used in boardrooms when the deal was in trouble, but he hadn't lost it yet. "Victor," she said, "I think we should talk privately." "I don't think we need to," she said. "What I have to say, I'm going to say in front of everyone." The word landed between them like something dropped from a height. Victor stepped closer. His voice dropped. "Whatever you're planning, whatever this is, I am telling you right now, as the father of your children and the man who—" "Don't," she said, quietly, simply. The word was not raised. It was placed. "Don't use the children for this. Not tonight." He looked at her for a long moment. "You don't know what you're doing," he said. She picked up her sparkling water from the small tray table beside her, and she looked at him with those calm, deep eyes, and she said, "Victor, I have known exactly what I was doing for 6 months. The question is whether you would like to sit down before the speech or after." He stared at her. "After," she said, answering her own question. "I thought so." She turned toward the stage, and across the room, Scarlett Hayes watched this exchange from her seat and felt something cold move through her. Something she had no name for yet, but that her body understood before her mind did. Because Evelyn Sterling had not argued with him, had not begged him, had not even seemed particularly interested in him. She had spoken to Victor Sterling the way you speak to something that has already been decided, with a kind of remote, settled certainty that Scarlett had only ever seen on one type of face. The face of someone who has already won and is simply watching the clock run out. Scarlett set down her champagne. For the first time since she had walked into this ballroom on Victor Sterling's arm, she was afraid. Not of Evelyn, of what Evelyn knew, and in the pocket of her own small silver clutch, next to her lipstick and her phone, was a drive. A small, silver, unremarkable drive that contained financial records she had been told were already destroyed. Records that traced the movement of $4 million through a series of shell accounts. Accounts that existed in the paper reality of banking, in her name. She had been told it was taken care of. She had been told there was nothing to worry about. She reached into her clutch and touched the drive, just to confirm it was still there. It was, and it meant nothing, because the information that mattered, the information that Evelyn Sterling had spent 6 months assembling with the patience and precision of a woman who understood that this one night needed to be perfect, was already loaded onto the servers that control the screens behind the stage of the Silver Crest Gala, and the keynote speech was scheduled to begin in 12 minutes. 9:32 p.m. Victor Sterling was still standing in the middle of the ballroom, and his phone was still in his pocket, and his lawyer's text, 3 words, "Call me immediately," was burning against his ribs like a coal. He did not call. Not yet. Because calling would mean stepping out. Stepping out would mean leaving Evelyn in this room without his eyes on her. And something in the base of his spine, something that had kept him alive in 40 years of cutthroat business, was telling him that taking his eyes off Evelyn Sterling right now was the last thing he should do. He watched her cross toward the stage area, unhurried, stopping once to speak to a woman he didn't immediately recognize. Then he placed her. Judith Farrow, head of the city's nonprofit accountability commission. Victor had never personally met Judith Farrow. He had never needed to. The Sterling Foundation had always maintained its own internal audits, and the board had always signed off. And nobody had ever asked questions that required answers from someone at Judith Farrow's level. He turned back toward his table. Scarlett was watching him from across the room, with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not fear exactly, something more controlled than fear, and more dangerous. The expression of a person running calculations. He sat down beside her. "She's talking to Judith Farrow," Scarlett said immediately, her voice low. "I see that. Victor, Judith Farrow doesn't come to charity galas. I've been to 12 events this year, and she has never—" "I know who she is." "Then you know why that's a problem." "Scarlett." His voice was sharp, a warning tone she had heard before, but not often. "Lower your voice." She did, but her eyes didn't lower. "You told me everything was clean. You told me the accounts were restructured and the documentation was amended and there was nothing that—" "Everything is clean. Then why is she here?" Victor poured himself a glass of water from the carafe on the table. He took a long drink. He set the glass down precisely. These were the movements of a man performing composure for an audience. The performance was excellent. "Evelyn invited her," he said, "as a guest, to make a show of transparency. It means nothing." Scarlett looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her champagne, drank, and said nothing else. But her hand, when she set the glass down, had a slight tremor in it. Victor noticed. He didn't address it. At 9:38, Davis Park returned to the podium to announce that the keynote address from Foundation Chairman Victor Sterling would begin in approximately 15 minutes, following a brief presentation from the Foundation's program directors. Applause moved through the room like a wave. Victor nodded to the room with the ease of a man who has been applauded his entire adult life. Across the room, Evelyn Sterling was no longer standing near the stage. Victor scanned. His eyes moved quickly, practiced, professional. He found her at table 14. She was seated, next to Dana Whitfield. They were talking. Not the polite small talk of two people who have just met. The leaned-in, focused, unhurried conversation of two people with shared purpose. Victor's jaw tightened. Harrison Crane appeared at his shoulder from nowhere, which was Harrison's gift. "Victor, can we step away for a moment?" "Not now. It needs to be now." Something in Harrison's tone, flat, stripped of its usual cushion, made Victor turn to look at him. Harrison's face was the color of old paper. Victor had known this man for 20 years and had never seen him frightened. "What?" Victor said. "The board had a meeting," Harrison said, 2 days ago. "A meeting you weren't informed about." The air between them changed. "That's not possible. Board meetings require my signature to convene." "Emergency sessions don't." Article 9 of the Foundation Charter. If 3 members petition for an emergency session, It convenes without the chairman's approval. Harrison paused. 7 members petitioned. Victor stared at him. 7 out of 9 board members. 7. To call an emergency session without telling him. To do it 2 days before the gala. He ran the names in his head. Who would have? Who could have? And stopped when he reached Margaret Holloway. And then Robert Park. And then Angela Chen. People Evelyn had been speaking to all evening. People Evelyn had spent 6 months rebuilding. "What was the agenda?" Victor said. Harrison handed him a folded sheet of paper. Victor opened it, read it. His face didn't move. A very good face. 30 years of negotiation had made it into something like stone when it needed to be. But his hands were not 30 years of negotiation. His hands were just hands. The paper shook, just slightly, just once. He folded it and put it in his pocket next to his lawyer's unread text and the coal that had been burning there since 9/21. "Who gave this to you?" he said. "Does it matter?" "Harrison. Thomas Reeves," Harrison said quietly. "Victor, Thomas Reeves gave it to me. Your own legal counsel." Victor looked across the room toward Thomas Reeves, who was seated at table 7 and was not looking back at him. Thomas Reeves, who had handed Evelyn a folded piece of paper earlier that evening, and whom Evelyn had thanked without reading it, because she already knew what was in it. Because she had written it. 9:45 p.m. The program directors finished their presentation to warm applause. Davis Park announced a 10-minute intermission before the keynote. Servers moved through the room with coffee and dessert plates. The noise level rose in the relaxed, aimless way of a crowd that doesn't know it's sitting inside a trap. Scarlett excused herself to the restroom. She didn't go to the restroom. She went to the small corridor off the east side of the ballroom, the one that led to the service entrance and the coat check. And she took out her phone and dialed a number she had committed to memory and never saved as a contact. It rang 4 times. "Pick up," she whispered. "Pick up, pick up." The call went to voicemail. She ended it, dialed again. 4 rings. Voicemail. She leaned against the corridor wall and pressed both hands flat against the cool surface and breathed. In through her nose, out through her mouth. She was 26 years old, and she had made decisions in the last 18 months that she had believed with complete confidence were calculated, smart, worth it. And they had been worth it, on paper. On paper, everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to look. But paper was a thing that other people could read. She dialed a 3rd number. This one answered on the 2nd ring. "Marcus," she said, "I need you to tell me right now, the Geneva accounts, the ones we restructured in February, are they clean?" A pause on the other end, long enough to be its own answer. "Marcus?" "Scarlett, where are you calling from?" "A hallway. Tell me about the accounts." Another pause. "I need you to not panic." "Tell me about the accounts." "There was a subpoena," he said, "filed 3 weeks ago. I found out this morning. I was trying to reach you." She ended the call. She stood in the corridor for exactly 6 seconds. Then she walked back into the ballroom, crossed to the bar, ordered a vodka soda she didn't intend to drink, and stood with the glass in her hand and her face arranged into an expression of polite boredom, while her mind moved at a speed that she had never before needed it to move. 3 weeks ago. A subpoena 3 weeks ago. Victor had told her in October that everything was clean. He had said it the way he said everything, with such absolute certainty that the certainty itself became the evidence. She had believed him not because she was naive, but because she had needed to believe him. And there is a difference, though the result is often the same. She found Victor at his table. "We need to talk," she said. "Not here." "Victor." "Not Here. He didn't look at her. He was watching the stage. Davis Park had returned to the podium. The intermission was ending. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the chairman of the Sterling Foundation and the driving force behind this great institution's 23 years of service to this city. Victor straightened in his chair. Please welcome Victor Sterling. The applause was strong, practiced, the kind of applause that fills rooms at events like this one, where everyone claps because everyone else is clapping, and the act of not clapping requires more social courage than most people possess. Victor Sterling stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the stage. And at that exact moment, Evelyn Sterling rose from her seat at table 14, and Dana Whitfield opened her notebook, and Judith Farrow set down her coffee, and Margaret Holloway turned in her chair to face the stage directly, and every board member in the room did the same. And the alignment of it, the synchronicity, was so precise that it looked choreographed. Because it was. Every single person who stood or turned or lifted their eyes in that moment had been told, in a phone call or an email or a quiet conversation over the last 3 weeks, exactly what was going to happen tonight, and exactly what their role in it was. Evelyn had spent 6 months on logistics and 12 minutes on timing. The 12 minutes were going to matter more. Victor reached the podium. He looked out at 700 people, and he saw what he expected to see. His world, his event, his crowd. And whatever had been shaking inside him for the last 40 minutes, he pressed down with the practiced force of ego and will, and walked it to a place where it couldn't interfere. He was Victor Sterling. He had been in worse rooms than this. He had survived worse threats than an estranged wife with a grudge and a few sympathetic board members. "Thank you," he said into the microphone. His voice was warm, presidential. 23 years ago, someone who believed in this city had a vision. And then Evelyn Sterling walked onto the stage. Not rushing, not dramatic. She walked from the left side of the stage with the even, unhurried step of someone who had been told she had 5 minutes and intended to use every second of it with precision. The room went silent. Not the polite silence of an audience between sentences, the sharp, dropped silence of 700 people processing something that does not fit the shape of their expectations. Victor stopped speaking. He turned. They stood on the same stage, 6 feet apart, for a moment that felt much longer than it was. And then Evelyn said, into the microphone that Davis Park was holding out to her with stunned compliance, "Thank you, Davis. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I need 5 minutes, and I promise the Foundation's donors, all of you, that you need to hear this." Victor found his voice. "Evelyn, 5 minutes, Victor." She said his name the way you say the name of something that has already been resolved. He stepped back from the podium, not graciously, not calmly. He stepped back because 700 people were watching, and because the one thing his entire life had taught him was that the moment you appear to lose control of a room, you have lost it. So he stepped back and stood to the side and arranged his face into something that approximated patience, and inside that face, something was breaking apart at speed. Evelyn stepped to the microphone. "My name is Evelyn Sterling," she said. "Most of you know me. Some of you knew me better before last year than you do now. And that's all right. I understand how these things work." A pause. Not for effect, for breath. Real breath. This foundation was built on the belief that accountability matters, that transparency is not just a word on a mission statement, but a practice, a discipline, a daily choice. She looked out at the room. I believed that when I made my first call to a donor in 2001, in a rented office with 2 folding chairs and no air conditioning. I still believe it tonight. At table 9, a woman pressed her hand to her mouth. At table 3, two men exchanged a look. At the bar, a server stopped moving and just listened. 12 days ago, Evelyn continued, I delivered a complete financial audit of the Sterling Foundation to the Board of Directors, the city's Nonprofit Accountability Commission, and the offices of the federal attorney. That audit documents, with full supporting evidence, the transfer of approximately $4.6 million from foundation accounts into a series of private entities over a period of 4 years. The silence in the room changed. It became something with weight. The screens behind me, she said, contain a summary of those findings. The screens behind her lit up. Bank statements, transfer records, shell company registrations, emails. Not summaries, not allegations, documents. The kind of documents that have dates and signatures and account numbers and the specific, irrefutable language of reality. The room erupted, not in shouting, in the thousand-voiced murmur of 700 people processing information simultaneously. The intake of breath, the urgent whispers, the sound of chairs adjusting and phones appearing in hands, and the particular gasp of people who have just understood something they suspected but had not confirmed. Victor moved toward the microphone. These are fabricated documents, and I will not stand here and allow— They've been verified, Evelyn said, quietly, into a second microphone that a stage manager had materialized from somewhere. By 3 independent forensic accounting firms. Their letters of certification are on the final slide. She clicked to the final slide. 3 letterheads, 3 signatures, 3 dates within the last 30 days. Victor stopped moving toward the microphone. He stood on the stage in front of 700 people, and he looked at the screens, and he understood, in the specific way that only truly intelligent people understand, the completeness of their own defeat, that there was no version of this room that he could still win. Not tonight. Not with this evidence on these screens in front of these specific people. He looked down at the front row. Angela Chen, Margaret Holloway, Robert Park, Thomas Reeves. His board, his people. Except they weren't anymore. They were looking at the screens with the careful, deliberate attention of people who had already read every document on those screens and were watching the audience catch up to where they had been for weeks. He looked at table 14. Dana Whitfield was writing. He looked at the cluster of people near the east wall who had not been there an hour ago and who were now visible as what they were, because Evelyn had not been discreet about inviting them, had not needed to be discreet. 3 federal agents in civilian clothes who had been in this building since 6 p.m. with a warrant in their pocket. Victor Sterling looked at all of this and made the only calculation left available to him. He turned toward the exit. He did not run. He walked, controlled, straight-backed, the walk of a man choosing to leave, not fleeing. Except there were cameras, and there were phones, and there are no exits that look like choices when 700 people are watching you take them. He made it to the edge of the stage. Mr. Sterling. The voice came from the base of the stage stairs. Male. Calm. Official. The agent didn't raise it. He didn't need to. We'd prefer if you stayed in the room tonight. Victor stopped. He stood at the top of the stage stairs and looked down at the man and understood that the next 12 hours of his life had just been decided by someone else. He turned around. He walked back to the podium. He stood there because there was nowhere else to stand, and in the back of the ballroom, at the bar where she had been standing with an untouched vodka soda for 22 minutes. Scarlett Hayes watched Victor Sterling walk back to the podium and watched the screens still burning with documents that had her name on them. Not prominently, not on every page, but there, unmistakably there, on the account registrations and the transfer authorizations and the 2 emails that used her personal address. And she felt the specific, terrible sensation of a floor dropping away. She had known this was possible. She had told herself it was unlikely. The difference between those two things had just become the story of her life. She set the vodka soda on the bar with a careful, quiet click. And then a hand touched her arm. She turned. The woman beside her was not a guest. No gown, no jewelry, no champagne. She wore a dark blazer and had a lanyard against her chest with an ID that Scarlett's eyes had 1 second to process before the woman said quietly, "Ms. Hayes, my name is Special Agent Renata Cole. I'm going to need to ask you a few questions." Scarlett looked at her. "Now?" she said. Her voice was very steady. She was surprised by how steady it was. "If you don't mind," the agent said. It was not a request. Scarlett looked at the stage one more time. Victor was still standing at the podium. He was not looking at her. He was not looking at anyone. He was looking at the middle distance, the way a man looks when the room he is in is no longer the room that matters. Then she looked at Evelyn. Evelyn was standing to the side of the stage, speaking in a low voice to Margaret Holloway, her hand resting briefly on the older woman's arm. Whatever she was saying made Margaret nod, once, with finality. Evelyn's expression was not triumphant. It was not relieved. It was focused and present and entirely, utterly calm in the way that very few people are calm. Not the calm of someone who has suppressed something, but the calm of someone who has resolved something. Deeply, completely, in the private interior where real decisions live. She did not look at Scarlett, not even once. And somehow, that was the worst of it. Not the agent beside her, not the documents on the screens, not the voice in her ear that was still speaking official words she was processing at a delay. What was worst was that Evelyn Sterling had planned every detail of this night with enough care to include the federal agents and the board members and the journalists and the forensic accountants and the emergency session and the certified documents on the screens. And in all of that meticulous, months-long architecture, Scarlett Hayes had not warranted a single glance. She had been, in Evelyn Sterling's calculation, a minor element. A conduit, as someone would later write. A footnote in someone else's story. "Miss Hayes," the agent said again. "Yes," Scarlett said. "All right." She picked up her small silver clutch from the bar, and inside it, against her fingers, was the drive she had touched 2 hours ago for reassurance. And she understood now, with perfect clarity, that it would not reassure her, and had not reassured her, and had in fact never been anything but evidence she had been carrying in her own hand all evening. She walked with Agent Cole toward the east corridor. She did not look back at Victor. She did not look back at the stage. She walked forward because there was nothing behind her worth looking at anymore, and that understanding, that loss, was its own particular kind of devastation. Not because she had loved Victor Sterling, not exactly, but because she had believed in the version of herself that stood beside him, and that version was gone now, dismantled in 45 minutes by a woman in a black dress who hadn't even needed to raise her voice. Behind her, in the ballroom, the noise was building. Investors were on their phones. Board members were in conference. Davis Park was at the podium saying things that nobody was listening to. And Evelyn Sterling stepped down from the stage, smoothed the front of her midnight black gown, and walked into the center of the room that had been hers for 23 years. 10:17 p.m. The ballroom had not emptied. That was the thing nobody had anticipated. Not the agents, not the journalists, not even Evelyn herself. 700 people who had every reason to leave, who had phones full of notifications and cars waiting downstairs and early morning meetings to prepare for, simply did not go. They stayed. They pulled their chairs into tighter clusters. They spoke in low, urgent voices and watched the stage and watched Evelyn and watched the doors through which Victor Sterling had tried to walk and failed. And they stayed, because what was happening inside this building was the kind of thing that people sense, on a cellular level, they will spend the rest of their lives describing to other people. And nobody wants to describe a thing they left early. Evelyn felt the weight of their attention like weather. She had always been sensitive to rooms, to the emotional temperature of a gathering, the shifting alliances and anxieties that moved through a crowd the way currents move through water. It was a skill she had developed over 23 years of standing beside a man who used rooms as instruments, and she had learned it so thoroughly that she had eventually stopped thinking of it as a skill and started experiencing it simply as awareness. Right now, the room was afraid. Not of her. That distinction mattered. The room was afraid of what it had just learned about itself, about how close it had stood, for how long, to something corrupt, and how well that corruption had been dressed. Margaret Holloway reached her first. The older woman took both of Evelyn's hands in hers and held them without speaking for a moment. Then she said, "You did it exactly right." "I did what needed doing," Evelyn said. "That is exactly right," Margaret repeated, and her voice had a firmness in it that was really a form of grief. Angela Chen appeared at Evelyn's shoulder. She had a phone pressed to her ear and was speaking in clipped, precise sentences to someone on the other end, and she touched Evelyn's arm briefly as she passed. Not a gesture of congratulation, but of acknowledgement. The gesture one professional makes to another after a hard thing has been executed well. Thomas Reeves arrived next. He was Victor's attorney, or had been, and the past tense of that was still settling into his expression when he said, "The board is convening in the East Suite in 20 minutes. Full quorum. They want you there." "I'll be there," Evelyn said. He nodded and moved away, and Evelyn turned toward the center of the room and paused. Victor was still at the far end of the ballroom, near the stage, standing with the federal agent who had stopped him at the stairs. They were not speaking loudly. Whatever was being communicated between them was happening in the compressed, careful register of official conversation. Victor's posture was still composed. His jacket was still buttoned. He was performing, even now, the role of a man in control of his circumstances, and the performance was almost good enough to believe. Almost. Because Evelyn knew his hands. She had known his hands for 23 years, and from across the room, even at this distance, she could see that his left hand, the one that hung at his side, away from the agent, away from the cameras, was closed into a fist. She turned away. She didn't need to watch. This part was no longer hers to manage. 10:29 p.m. Dana Whitfield had found a corner table and was typing with the speed of someone in a controlled emergency, her phone propped against a water glass, showing a recording in progress. Her notebook open beside her laptop, with handwriting that slanted hard to the right under pressure. She had been a journalist for 19 years and had covered 3 federal investigations and 1 gubernatorial corruption case. And what had happened on that stage 20 minutes ago was the cleanest, most thoroughly documented public exposure of financial misconduct she had ever witnessed in person. She stopped typing long enough to look up at Evelyn, who was now making her way toward the East Suite. And she thought about the phone call she had received 8 weeks ago. A woman's voice, measured, intelligent, not hostile, not frightened, not performing the drama of victimhood, simply direct. "I have documentation of financial fraud involving the Sterling Foundation. The evidence is substantial and verified. I'd like to discuss the public interest dimension of this story." Dana had heard that kind of call before. Usually, it was messier, emotionally tangled, legally murky, the evidence thinner than the grievance. She had almost redirected the call to her editor's assistant. Something made her stay on the line. By the end of that first conversation, she had understood 3 things. The evidence was real. The woman was serious. And the story was not about a divorce. It had never been about a divorce. She went back to typing. In the hallway east of the ballroom, Scarlett Hayes was seated in a chair that had been brought from somewhere by someone, because Special Agent Renata Cole was thorough in the small bureaucratic decencies even when the larger situation had collapsed entirely. Scarlett sat with her clutch on her knees and her back straight, and she answered the questions she was asked in a voice that she kept very controlled. And she did not ask for a lawyer yet, because asking for a lawyer felt like a door closing on a version of tonight that she was still, some irrational part of her, hoping might change. "The accounts registered in your name in February," Cole said. "Were you the beneficial owner of those accounts?" "They were registered in my name," Scarlett said. "That's not the same question as the one you asked." Cole looked at her. Something shifted in the agent's expression. Not sympathy, but recognition. "You're right," she said. "It isn't." "I was told the restructuring was a standard liability framework," Scarlett said. "I was told my name was being used administratively, not beneficially." "Who told you that?" Scarlett looked at the opposite wall. "Ms. Hayes." "I want to be very precise about what I say next," Scarlett said, "because I understand that what I say next matters considerably." "That's accurate," Cole said. Scarlett turned the clutch over in her hands once, twice. "Victor Sterling told me," she said, "in November. He said the accounts were a standard framework used by multiple investors. He said my name was one of 4 names being used as administrative holders. He said there was no personal liability. He said it was paperwork." Cole wrote. "I believed him," Scarlett said. And then, quietly, almost to herself, "I needed to believe him." Cole looked up. "I know," she said. And she did. She had been doing this long enough to know. Back in the ballroom, 10:41 p.m., a sound that nobody had been expecting broke through the low collective murmur of the crowd. It was Victor Sterling's voice, and it was not controlled anymore. "This is a setup," he said, loudly enough for the nearest 30 people to hear. He was still standing near the stage, but something in the last 10 minutes had worn through the composure he had been maintaining. And what was underneath it was not fear, not yet, but rage. The particular rage of a man who has spent his entire adult life defining the terms of every situation he enters, and has just discovered that the terms of this one were written by someone else. "This is a coordinated attack on my character and my life's work, and every single person in this room who participated in it is going to hear from my attorneys." The agent beside him said something in a low voice. Victor didn't acknowledge it. "I built this foundation," he said, and now he was speaking to the room at large, to whoever would listen, to the audience he had always known how to hold. "I raised the money. I made the calls. I put my name on the line for 23 years, and I will not stand here and let a bitter, vindictive Victor—" The voice came from the stage. Margaret Holloway had returned to the microphone. 72 years old. Founding board member. The woman who had written the foundation's original charter by hand in a law office in 1998. She stood at the microphone, and she looked at Victor Sterling across the room, and she said his name the way you say it when a name is the last thing you intend to give someone. "Sit down," she said. The room went very quiet. Victor looked at her. "Sit down, Victor," she said again. "You're embarrassing yourself. And more importantly, you're embarrassing this institution. Whatever happens next, this room does not need to witness it." Something moved across Victor's face. A cascade of things, actually. Anger and shame, and the particular agony of being corrected by someone whose opinion you have, despite everything, always valued. Margaret Holloway had been in his corner since the beginning. She had defended him at board meetings, vouched for him to donors, covered for delays and inconsistencies with the patient loyalty of someone who genuinely believed in the man behind the institution. past tense. He understood, looking at her face, that it was past tense now. He sat down, not because she told him to, not entirely. He sat down because his legs, for the first time in 30 years of standing rooms, felt uncertain beneath him. 11 p.m. The East Suite was a conference room with a long table and a credenza, and the particular atmosphere of a space that has absorbed many serious conversations. The board's 9 members were seated around the table when Evelyn walked in, and the quality of their silence was different from the ballroom's silence. This was the silence of people who have already made their decision and are waiting to record it. Robert Park stood when she entered. Then Margaret. Then, one by one, the others. All 9 of them. Standing for Evelyn Sterling, in a room where 8 months ago, Victor Sterling had sat at the head of the table and informed them that his wife was no longer associated with the foundation in any capacity. Evelyn stood in the doorway and absorbed this. She pressed her lips together, just once. Then she crossed to the table and sat down. "The chair," Margaret said, nodding toward the seat at the head of the table. "Not tonight," Evelyn said. "Tonight we sit as equals. There's work to do." Thomas Reeves opened his folder. The board's emergency resolution from 2 days ago formally suspends Victor Sterling from the chairmanship pending investigation. That resolution becomes effective upon public announcement, which we can confirm has now occurred, given tonight's events. He looked up. "We need to appoint interim leadership immediately." "What does the charter require?" Evelyn asked. "A majority vote of present board members. 6 of 9 constitutes a majority." "Then let's vote," she said. Angela Chen said, "I'd like to nominate Evelyn Sterling as interim chair." Margaret seconded. The vote took 40 seconds. 9 in favor, 0 against, 0 abstentions. Evelyn looked at the 9 faces around the table and said, "Thank you. I want to be clear about something before we go any further. My taking this role is contingent on a full independent audit being completed and made public within 60 days. No exceptions, no extensions. If what we find is worse than what I've already documented, the public will know. If it's better, the public will know that too. This foundation does not get to manage its own narrative anymore. Not after tonight." A pause. Then Robert Park said, "Agreed." The others nodded. Evelyn reached for the notepad in front of her. She uncapped the pen that had been placed beside it, and she began to work. 11:18 p.m. Harrison Crane found Victor in the ballroom, still seated at the front table, still in his jacket, still with the particular stillness of a man who has run out of moves. The room had thinned. Guests had been filtering out for the last 30 minutes, some with the hurried departure of people who needed to scrub their association from the evening, others with the reluctant drift of those who had stayed as long as they could justify. A cluster of reporters remained near the stage. The 3 agents were visible near the exits. Harrison sat down across from his old friend and said nothing for a moment. "Don't," Victor said. "I'm not going to say anything," Harrison said. "Good." They sat. "How long have you known?" Victor said. Harrison looked at his hands on the table. "That something was building?" "6 weeks." "That it was this thorough?" He exhaled. "No, not until tonight." "She had the whole board," Victor said. It wasn't an accusation. It was closer to admiration, the way a general might acknowledge a strategy that outmaneuvered him completely. "She had Reeves, she had Farrow, she had the federal attorney's office." He shook his head very slowly. "She didn't miss anyone." "No," Harrison agreed. "She didn't." 23 years, Victor said. His voice changed on those words. Not softer exactly, hollowed. 23 years, and I looked at her, and I saw—" He stopped. "What?" Harrison asked. "Someone manageable," Victor said, and the words sat between them like a confession. Harrison said nothing. "I was wrong," Victor said. "Yes," Harrison said, "you were." Another silence. "My lawyer is outside," Victor said. "I know." "I need to go meet him." "I know that too." Victor Sterling picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and put it on. He straightened his cuffs. He buttoned the jacket's single button. These small, precise movements, the gestures of a man composing himself, took on a different quality now. They were not the preparations of someone entering a room. They were the rituals of someone trying to remember who they were before the room had changed. He stood. He looked at Harrison Crane one more time. 30 years, he said. 30 years, Harrison confirmed. Victor nodded, once, and walked toward the exit. This time, the agent near the door stepped aside. 11:31 p.m. Dana Whitfield finished her first draft at 11:28, read it through once, made 7 changes, and sent it to her editor, with a subject line that read, "Ready when you are." Then she closed her laptop and sat back and looked at the nearly empty ballroom, and thought about the woman in the black dress who had stood at a microphone tonight and dismantled a man's empire in 5 minutes of clean, sourced, verified testimony, and had looked, throughout all of it, exactly as calm as if she had been reading a grocery list. Dana had interviewed a lot of people in 19 years. Politicians, executives, whistleblowers, victims. She had learned to read the spectrum between performed composure and genuine composure, and they were very different things. Performed composure is a surface. It has tells, the jaw, the hands, the eyes, the micro-expressions, that slip through when a person is working too hard to hold the surface in place. Genuine composure is not a surface. It's structural. It comes from somewhere down in the foundation of a person where a decision was made, a real one, not a clever one, about what matters and what doesn't, and who they intend to be. Evelyn Sterling had genuine composure. That was the story, Dana thought. Not the fraud, that was the news. The story was a woman who had been handed a catastrophic loss and had taken 18 months to convert it into something precise and purposeful, and ultimately, more powerful than what it replaced. She reopened her laptop and added one more paragraph to the piece. In the East Suite, the board meeting continued. They worked through the emergency protocols with the focused efficiency of people who had already done the hard emotional work before tonight and were now simply executing. Donor communications, staff notifications, legal protocols, media response. The to-do list of an institution that had just had its foundation cracked and was determining in real time whether what was left was worth rebuilding. Evelyn led the meeting without leading it in the way that makes people feel led. She asked questions more than she directed. She referenced the charter when there were disagreements. She deferred to Thomas Reeves on legal questions, and to Angela Chen on financial ones, and to Margaret Holloway on matters of institutional history, because she understood that rebuilding trust required visible humility as much as visible competence. At 11:45, Margaret said, "There will be people tomorrow, donors, partners, board members at other institutions, who will say this was a personal vendetta, that you used the foundation as a vehicle for a divorce dispute." Evelyn looked at her. "I know. How do you want to handle that?" "With the audit," Evelyn said. "With 60 days of complete transparency. Let the work speak. I'm not interested in the narrative." A pause. "The narrative will follow the evidence, or it won't. And either way, we'll have done the right thing." Margaret studied her for a long moment. "You sound very certain," she said. "I am," Evelyn said. "I spent 6 months being certain." Angela Chen looked up from her papers. What did those 6 months look like, if you don't mind me asking? Evelyn considered the question. It was not a small question. 6 months was a compressed way of saying, the morning she woke up in a different apartment, smaller, quieter, on the east side, with none of the furniture she had chosen and none of the views she had gotten used to, and a coffee maker that was not the one she liked. 6 months was her daughter calling every Sunday and her son calling less often because he was 24 and didn't know how to be angry at both his parents simultaneously, and was trying to solve that by not choosing. 6 months was 2 attorneys and 3 accountants and 1 forensic specialist, and more late nights than she could count, sitting with documents at a table that was too small, building a case with the same discipline she had applied to every hard thing in her life, which was, start with what is true, then follow the truth wherever it leads, and do not stop until the picture is complete. Honest, she said. Those 6 months were honest, for the first time in a long time. No one spoke. Then Robert Park cleared his throat and said, then let's make sure the next 6 months are too. Midnight. Exactly. The Imperial Crown Ballroom was almost empty. A few staff remained, beginning the slow work of breaking down the event. The tables that had held 700 people 3 hours ago stood quiet under the overhead lights. Glasses half full, chairs pushed back at the angles of sudden departure. On the screens behind the stage, the last slide was still displaying 3 letterheads, 3 signatures, 3 dates. The evidence that had changed everything, still glowing in an empty room. A young server, 22 years old, working his 3rd event at this venue, stopped beside the AV technician who was preparing to shut down the system and said, "Should I take down those screens?" The technician looked at the slides for a moment. "Leave them," he said. "Someone will decide in the morning." The server nodded and moved on. On the 41st floor, in the private lounge adjacent to the East Suite, Evelyn Sterling sat alone for the first time in 3 hours. The board meeting had ended. The protocols were in place. The immediate work was done. Everyone had gone, to their cars, their phones, their own private reckoning with the evening. She sat with a cup of tea that someone had brought her, and that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. And she looked at the city through the window, the way you look at something that has been there your whole life, but that you are seeing, right now, as if for the first time. She thought about the moment she had stepped to that microphone, the 700 faces, the screens going live, Victor's voice behind her, and the specific, extraordinary stillness inside her chest in that moment. Not numbness, not performance, but the genuine quiet of a person who has arrived, finally, at the place they were aiming for. She had not enjoyed it. This was important to understand about herself. She had not stood on that stage and felt the pleasure of watching Victor Sterling's empire crack. She had felt the weight of what it cost. She had felt the years. She had felt her children, somewhere in the city, who would wake up tomorrow to a version of their family that would require new maps. What she had felt, underneath all of it, was something closer to grief than to victory. The grief of a woman who had loved a man who was not worth loving and had needed 2 decades to fully understand that, and who understood it now completely and was done. She finished the cold tea. She picked up her phone and dialed her daughter. 3 rings. Then, "Mom, it's midnight. Are you okay? I saw something online about—" "I'm okay," Evelyn said. "I'm more than okay. I'll tell you everything tomorrow. I just wanted to hear your voice." A pause. Then her daughter said softly, "What happened tonight?" Evelyn looked at the city, at the lights that went all the way to the water and beyond. "Something that needed to happen," she said, "for a long time." Her daughter was quiet for a moment. "Are you coming home?" she asked. And Evelyn Sterling, sitting alone in a room 41 floors above the city she had helped build a piece of, holding a cold cup of tea and the full weight of a night that had changed everything, said, "Yes, I'm coming home." She ended the call. She stood. She straightened her midnight black gown, and she walked out. The morning after the Silvercrest Gala arrived the way mornings do after nights that change things. Quietly, indifferently, with full sunlight and the ordinary sounds of a city that does not pause for anyone's private catastrophe. But New York was not entirely ordinary that morning. By 6:47 a.m., Dana Whitfield's piece had been live for 4 hours and had been read by 300,000 people. By 8 a.m., that number had doubled. By 9, the story had moved off the Times website and onto every major news platform in the country, and the name Victor Sterling had become the kind of name that people say with a particular tone, not the tone of admiration or envy or even hatred, but the specific deflated tone of someone who has been proven wrong about a person they were once impressed by. Evelyn learned all of this from her daughter. She had slept 4 hours, which was more than she expected. She woke in the apartment on the east side, still too small, still not entirely hers in the way a space becomes yours over time. And she lay in the early light and listened to the city and felt, for the first time in 14 months, something that was not urgency, something slower, something that might, eventually, become peace. Her daughter arrived at 7:30 with coffee and her phone already showing notifications she couldn't stop refreshing. Her name was Claire, 27 years old, with her mother's eyes and her father's jaw, and the particular resilience of a child who has absorbed her parents' marriage slowly enough to not be destroyed by its ending. "Mom," she said, setting the coffee on the counter and turning the phone to show the screen, "it's everywhere." Evelyn looked at the screen. She looked at the headline. Sterling Foundation chair exposed, fraud, shell companies, and the woman who built the case. And she looked at the photograph beside it, taken apparently from a guest's phone, showing her standing at the microphone with the documents projected behind her. She studied the photograph for a moment the way you study a picture of yourself taken when you didn't know you were being photographed. The woman in the photograph looked entirely composed, entirely certain. She looked, Evelyn thought, like someone who knew what she was doing. Good, she thought, because she had. "Are you okay?" Claire asked. "I'm okay. Dad called me this morning, at 6. Evelyn looked up. "What did he say?" Claire wrapped her hands around her own coffee cup. "He said you ambushed him. He said the documents were misleading and that his lawyers are going to demonstrate that everything was legal and properly authorized." A pause. "He said you did this because you're angry about the divorce." The word divorce landed between them with all the weight it always had in this family, which was considerable. "What did you say?" Evelyn asked. "I said I'd seen the documents," Claire said. "He sent me documents last night at 2 a.m., his own versions. I'm not an accountant. I don't know what I'm looking at." She looked at her mother. "But I know what I felt watching those screens last night." "What did you feel?" "That you weren't angry," Claire said. "Angry people don't work like that. Angry people make noise." She paused. "You were methodical." Evelyn looked at her daughter for a long moment and felt the specific tenderness of being seen clearly by someone who has every reason to see you partially. "I was both," Evelyn said. "In the beginning, I was angry, but anger isn't a plan." Claire nodded. She understood this the way young people understand things that they haven't yet needed to apply. Theoretically, but completely. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Evelyn said, "we find out how deep it goes." 9:14 a.m. The Sterling Foundation's offices occupied the 14th floor of a building in Midtown, and on any other Tuesday morning, they would have been quiet until 9. alive with the particular focused energy of a small staff doing meaningful work by 10, and unremarkable by noon. This Tuesday morning, there were 7 people waiting in the lobby when the building manager unlocked the doors at 8:30. 5 of them were reporters. 1 was a former employee. One was Angela Chen, who had been awake since 4 a.m. and who had already spoken to 3 board members, 2 lawyers, and the forensic accounting firm that had been central to the audit. Angela went directly to her office and began making calls that needed to be made. She called the foundation's major donors in order of giving level, largest first. And she said the same thing to each of them, which was, "The situation is serious. The board is handling it with full transparency. No donor funds have been lost, and we will have a complete written update to you within 24 hours." Most of them listened. Some of them were already angry. A few, the ones who had known Victor longest, who had sat at his tables and laughed at his stories and believed in the institution because they believed in him, were not angry, but something more complicated. Stunned. The specific stun of people whose judgment has been called into question by the failure of the person they vouched for. Angela was on her 11th call when her assistant knocked and entered without waiting, which was unusual enough to make Angela say, "Hold on a second," into the phone. "Scarlett Hayes is downstairs," the assistant said. Angela went very still. "She's asking to see Evelyn." "Evelyn isn't here yet. She says she'll wait." Angela held the phone away from her face and thought for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said into the phone, "I'll call you back," and stood up and took her jacket from the back of her chair and put it on. Scarlett was in the lobby, seated in one of the 4 chairs that lined the wall near the reception desk. She was not wearing last night's red gown. She was wearing a dark coat over what appeared to be whatever she had reached for first that morning. And she looked like a person who had not slept, which she had not. She had spent the night in a hotel room 2 blocks from the venue, because going back to Victor's apartment had felt impossible, and going anywhere else had required a decision she hadn't been capable of making at 2 in the morning. She had spent the night with her phone and her thoughts, and the specific, nauseating clarity that arrives when the story you have been telling yourself about your own life is no longer sustainable. When Angela Chen came through the lobby door, Scarlett stood. Angela looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Come upstairs." They sat across from each other in Angela's office, and Angela did not offer coffee, and Scarlett did not ask for it. The morning light came through the window and fell between them, and neither of them was interested in pretending this was a comfortable situation. "I want to cooperate," Scarlett said. "Fully. I want to make that clear before anything else." "Cooperate with the board or with the federal investigation?" "Both," Scarlett said. "Both." Angela studied her. She was a good reader of people, and what she read in Scarlett Hayes this morning was not contrition performed for an audience. It was the rawer, less composed thing, the expression of someone who has spent a sleepless night arriving at a conclusion that they are not happy about, but that they have genuinely reached. "What changed?" Angela asked. "Last night you had an agent asking you questions in a hallway. This morning, you're here. What happened between those 2 things?" Scarlett looked at her hands. "I thought about who I am," she said, "and who I was, and the distance between those 2 things." A pause. "I have a degree from Georgetown. I spent 4 years doing legitimate financial analysis. I was good at it. I had a career that I was building, and I made a choice 14 months ago that I told myself was strategic. And I told myself that the accounts were administrative. And I told myself that the restructuring was standard. And every one of those things I told myself, because the alternative was understanding that I had traded something real for something that looked good from the outside." She looked up. "I was an instrument. I understand that now. Angela said nothing for a moment. Then, the board's interest is in the foundation, in recovering what can be recovered and preventing further damage. If your cooperation contributes to that, it's relevant. It will, Scarlett said. I have documentation that wasn't on those slides last night. Emails, meeting records. There were conversations I was present for that are directly relevant to the timeline of the transfers. She reached into her coat pocket and placed a phone on Angela's desk. I backed everything up 3 months ago, when I started to feel like something wasn't right. I didn't act on it then. I'm acting on it now. Angela looked at the phone. Why didn't you come forward then? She asked. Scarlett was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that earns its length. Then she said, because I wasn't ready to accept what coming forward meant about the choices I had made. She paused. I'm ready now. Angela picked up her own phone and called Thomas Reeves. 10:55 a.m. Evelyn arrived at the Foundation offices at 10:45 to find that her day had already been organized by Angela with the efficiency of a woman who treated chaos as a project management problem. There was a schedule. There were calls stacked in 30-minute blocks. There was a press statement that Thomas had drafted and that needed Evelyn's review and signature. There was a board call at noon. There was a meeting with a forensic accounting firm at 2. There was a call with the federal attorney's office at 4. And there was, Angela told her in the doorway of what was temporarily Evelyn's office, a visitor who had been waiting since 9:15. Evelyn looked at Angela. Angela said the name. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Where is she? Conference room 2. Evelyn set down her bag. She took off her coat. She stood for a moment with her hands flat on the desk and breathed in the particular way she had learned to breathe when she needed the space between an impulse and a response to be larger than it naturally wanted to be. Then she said, Give me 20 minutes to go through the press statement. Then I'll see her. Angela nodded and left. The 20 minutes were not about the press statement. Evelyn read the press statement in 4 minutes, made 2 edits, and spent the remaining 16 minutes sitting in a chair by the window. She thought about what she wanted from the conversation she was about to have. She was honest with herself about this because she had made a commitment, privately, months ago, sitting at her small table with her documents, that when this night came, and the morning after, she would not deceive herself about her own motives. It was the condition she had set for herself. You can want this, you can execute this, but you cannot tell yourself it costs you nothing. You cannot tell yourself you feel nothing. And you cannot go into any room pretending to be above the human weight of what happened to you. She was not above it. She had never claimed to be. She thought about the morning of the Instagram photograph, the robe, the coffee, the 4 seconds she had looked at her phone before putting it face down on the table. She thought about what it had felt like to be replaced, not in secret, not with any of the small dignities that people extend to each other, even in betrayal, but publicly, with a photograph and a publicist, and the particular contempt of a man who had decided her feelings were no longer a consideration. She had earned this morning. She had earned every part of it. And the woman in conference room 2 was 26 years old and had been used by the same man and had not known fully what she was being used for. Evelyn picked up the press statement and walked down the hall. She did not go to conference room 2 first. She went to Thomas Reeves' office. She knocked once and opened the door. Thomas looked up. He had the expression of a man who has been expecting a reckoning and is relieved it has finally arrived. Tell me what she gave Angela, Evelyn said. Thomas told her. The additional documentation, the emails, the meeting records, the phone records from 3 months ago showing a series of calls between Scarlett and a contact in the Geneva office that had not appeared in the original audit. Not because Evelyn had missed them, but because at the time of the audit, Those records had not yet been obtained. They had been obtained last week by a different team, and they changed the timeline. Evelyn stood in Thomas's doorway and listened and felt something shift inside her chest. Not what she expected. Not satisfaction. Something more complicated. The additional documentation pushed the origin of the fraud back 18 months further than the audit had indicated. Back to a period before Scarlett Hayes had entered Victor's orbit. Back to a period when the accounts had been established using names that were not Scarlett's, which meant what she had suspected and what Scarlett had claimed this morning aligned. Scarlett Hayes had not designed the fraud. She had been handed a role in it. "Does the federal attorney's office have this?" Evelyn asked. "They will by noon," Thomas said. Evelyn nodded once. She thanked him. She walked to conference room 2. Scarlett stood when she came in. They looked at each other across the conference table. The woman who had been replaced and the woman who had done the replacing. And the distance between them was both small and enormous in the way that things can be when the story is more complicated than the surface. "Sit down," Evelyn said. Her voice was not warm. It was not cruel. It was the voice of someone who has decided to deal with things as they are. They both sat. Silence for a moment. "I know why you came," Evelyn said. "I'm not sure you do," Scarlett said carefully. "You came because you want to separate yourself from what Victor built," Evelyn said, "and because you spent last night understanding that the best way to do that is to be useful to the people who are dismantling it." Scarlett looked at her. "That's part of it. What's the other part?" A pause, long enough to be real. "I wanted to tell you that I'm sorry." She said it without looking away, which Evelyn noted. "Not because it helps me. I understand it doesn't help me. But because you built something here that mattered, and I was a part of, even a small part of, what damaged it. And I'm sorry." The room held this. Evelyn looked at the woman across from her. 26 years old, smart enough to have understood the situation 6 months ago, and not quite brave enough, at the time, to act on that understanding. A woman who had confused proximity to power with possession of it, and had learned the difference the way most people learn hard lessons. Too late, and all at once. "The apology is noted," Evelyn said. "What happens now is not about you and me. What happens now is about the foundation and the 4,000 families whose literacy programs were underfunded because of where that money went. Keep your focus there. That's where mine is." Scarlett absorbed this. Then she nodded. "There's one more thing," she said. Evelyn waited. "The Geneva contact," Scarlett said. "The one in the phone records from 3 months ago. He wasn't working for Victor. Not entirely." She placed a folded piece of paper on the table. "He was working for a private equity group that was trying to acquire 2 of the foundation's real estate assets in Brooklyn. Assets that Victor was in the process of quietly devaluing through selective neglect, so they could be purchased below market." She paused. "It wasn't just about the money he was taking. He was positioning those assets for a sale that would have happened within the next 18 months. The buyers were already identified." Evelyn looked at the piece of paper. She did not pick it up yet. "Why are you telling me this separately? Why didn't you give this to Angela with the rest?" "Because this part," Scarlett said, "involves someone on your board." The room went very still. "Who?" Evelyn said. Scarlett told her. Evelyn sat with the name for a long moment. It was not the name she would have expected. It was not the name she would have chosen, if choosing were possible. It was the name of someone she had trusted during the last 6 months of preparation. Someone who had agreed to vote. Someone who had stood when she walked into the room. She felt the floor shift in the way she had learned, these past 14 months, to let floors shift without going down with them. "How certain are you?" she said.
The emails are in the file Angela has, Scarlett said. 3 of them. His private address.
Evelyn looked at the piece of paper on the table. She looked at the name written on it. She sat with the weight of it and the complexity of it and the specific exhaustion of a person who has done one hard thing completely right and discovered that the world immediately requires another. "Thank you," she said. She said it plainly, without warmth and without coldness. The way you say it when it is true and you have nothing to add. She picked up the piece of paper and folded it and put it in her pocket. She stood. "One question," Scarlett said. Evelyn paused. "How did you know?" Scarlett asked. "From the beginning. How did you know that everything you were building would hold? That the evidence would be enough? That the board would move? That the timing would work? How did you know none of it would fall apart?" Evelyn considered the question seriously. "I didn't," she said. "I knew the evidence was real. I knew the people I had spoken to were principled. I knew the case I had built was thorough." She paused. "But I didn't know none of it would fall apart. I just decided that not knowing wasn't a reason to stop." She left the conference room. She walked down the hall and stopped at the window that looked out over the Midtown rooftops and stood there for 30 seconds, no more. She allowed herself those 30 seconds, the weight of the name in her pocket, the expansion of what had been a targeted, contained operation into something that now had another layer, another betrayal, another hard conversation to have with a person she had believed was on her side. 30 seconds. Then she pushed off the window frame and walked to her temporary office and picked up her phone and called Angela. "I need you to pull the board meeting minutes from the last 8 months, she said when Angela answered. "Everything." Not the official minutes, the raw notes. Angela was quiet for a second. "Evelyn, what did she tell you?" "Pull the minutes and come to my office," Evelyn said, "and close the door when you come in." 1:11 p.m. Victor Sterling's attorney issued a public statement at 12:45, declaring that his client intended to cooperate fully with any official investigation, while maintaining that the documents presented at the Silvercrest Gala had been selectively compiled to create a misleading picture of Foundation governance, and that a full accounting would demonstrate that all financial activities were legally authorized and properly documented. The statement was 14 sentences long. Dana Whitfield read it in 40 seconds and wrote 4 words in her notebook. "They're going to settle." She was right, though it would take 6 more weeks for the settlement conversation to begin and another 4 months for it to conclude. But she could hear it in the language. The retreat from specifics, the pivot to process, the deliberate vagueness of legal authorization rather than legal innocence. These were not the words of a man who believed he could win a fight. These were the words of a man buying time to calculate the cost of losing. She filed a follow-up piece at 1 p.m. In the Foundation offices, Evelyn and Angela sat with the board meeting minutes spread between them, and the name in Evelyn's pocket became a name on a page, and then a pattern across multiple pages, and then a pattern that connected to the Brooklyn assets and the private equity group, and 3 phone calls that had been noted, obliquely, as external consultations in the governance record. "Robert," Angela said, when she had been reading for 20 minutes. Her voice was very quiet.
"Robert,"
Evelyn confirmed. Angela sat back in her chair. Robert Park, 11 years on the board. The first person who had stood when Evelyn walked into the East Suite last night. The man who had said, in a voice she had been moved by, "Then let's make sure the next 6 months are too." "He may not have known the full extent," Angela said. "He may have been approached as a business opportunity, not as part of the fraud." "That's possible," Evelyn said. "It's also possible that it doesn't matter from a legal standpoint." "You have to call him." "I know." "Before the board call at noon." Angela glanced at the clock. It was 1:14. The noon call had happened without this.
Before the end of the day.
I know, Evelyn said again. She sat for a moment with the phone in her hand and the weight of everything the morning had added to the night before. And the night before had already been enormous. And she understood, with a clear-eyed practicality that had carried her through 6 months of preparation, that this was the nature of the thing she had committed to. Transparency was not a door you opened selectively. You could not choose to expose the corruption that was convenient to expose and look away from the corruption that was painful. If Robert Park had a role in this, Robert Park needed to answer for it. Even if he had stood for her, even if he had voted, even if the loss of him from the board created a complication she had not accounted for. The truth did not negotiate terms. That was the thing she had learned in the 6 months of building this case, sitting at her small table in her too small apartment, working through documents at midnight. The truth had a logic of its own, and if you committed to following it, you had to follow it all the way. You could not stop where it became inconvenient. She dialed Robert Park. He answered on the second ring. "Evelyn?" His voice was careful. He already knew something was coming. People always know. "Robert," she said, "I need to talk to you about Brooklyn." The silence on the other end lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds that told her everything she needed to know about what had been happening in the spaces she hadn't been watching while she'd been focused on the spaces she had. "When?" he said. "Now," she said. "Come to the office." She ended the call. She looked out the window at the city and felt the full weight of the day pressing against her chest. The board, the documents, the betrayal she hadn't anticipated, the 26-year-old woman down the hall who had handed her another truth to follow. And she let herself feel it, all of it, completely, for exactly as long as it took her to take one full breath. Then she picked up her pen, and she went back to work. Robert Park arrived at the foundation offices at 2:17 p.m. and walked through the lobby with the posture of a man who has decided, on the ride over, exactly how much he intends to admit. Evelyn had seen that posture before. It was the posture of negotiation. The posture of someone who believes that if they control what they say first, they can still control what happens next. She met him in conference room 1. Not conference room 2, where she had spoken with Scarlett. A different room. She had chosen it deliberately. She had also chosen to be sitting when he arrived, with a cup of coffee in front of her and nothing else on the table, which was its own kind of statement. He sat across from her without being invited to and said, "Before you say anything, I want you to understand that what happened with the Brooklyn assets was never intended to harm the foundation." "Tell me what it was intended to do," Evelyn said. He looked at her. He was 64 years old, and he had a face that had spent decades communicating trustworthiness, and it was communicating it now, reflexively, even though the room did not require it, and both of them knew it. "The private equity group approached me 14 months ago," he said. "They had identified the 2 properties as undervalued, legitimately undervalued, based on deferred maintenance that predated Victor's tenure. They came to me as a board member to inquire about a potential sale process. I told them I would need to consult with the full board." "But you didn't," Evelyn said. "I consulted with Victor," he said. "He told me the properties were already under review for potential divestiture. He told me the process was moving through proper channels." "And when you saw that it wasn't?" The pause was long enough to be its own answer. "Robert," she said. Her voice was not angry. It was the voice of a person who has stopped being angry, because anger requires a kind of surprise that she no longer had access to. "When did you understand that the process was not moving through proper channels?" He looked at the table. 8 months ago, he said. "I received an email from the equity group that referenced a timeline that didn't match anything the board had approved. I asked Victor about it. He said there had been a miscommunication. I accepted that." "You accepted it," Evelyn said. I accepted it, he said, and the words cost him something. She could see it cost him. I had been on this board for 11 years, and I had a relationship with this institution that I believed in. And I told myself that Victor was managing a process I didn't fully understand, and He stopped. He pressed his fingers flat against the table. I chose not to look harder. The room held this. Evelyn looked at him for a long time, long enough for him to feel looked at. "The difference between you and Victor," she said finally, "is that you chose not to look. Victor looked directly at everything and chose it anyway." She paused. "That distinction matters legally. Whether it matters ethically is something you're going to have to work out for yourself." He looked up at her. "I'll submit my resignation from the board this afternoon," he said. "Yes," she said, "you will. And you'll cooperate fully with the investigation." "Not selectively. Fully. Yes. All of it, Robert. Every email, every call, every conversation you had with the equity group and with Victor. All of it." "Yes," he said a third time, and this time the word had lost its negotiating quality entirely. It was just a word, just an acknowledgement. The sound a person makes when they finally run out of ways to be anything other than honest. He stood. He picked up his jacket. At the door he paused without turning around. "For what it's worth," he said, "I voted for you last night because I believed you were right. That hasn't changed." "I know," Evelyn said. "That's the part that makes it complicated." He left. She sat alone in the room for 90 seconds. Then she picked up her phone and called Thomas Reeves and said, "Robert Park is resigning. Get the paperwork started. And call the federal attorney's office. He's going to have additional information for them." Thomas was quiet for a beat. "How bad is it on his end?" "Bad enough that he knew," Evelyn said. "Not bad enough that he designed it." She paused. "Tell them Matt, too." 3:04 p.m. The board call that had been scheduled for noon had been rescheduled to 3, then rescheduled again to 4, because the morning had added enough variables that running a board call without accounting for them felt, to Evelyn, like building on sand. By 3 p.m., she had Robert Park's email communications forwarded to the federal attorney's office, a replacement candidate for his board seat under consideration, and a revised version of the public statement that Thomas had been updating in real time as the day developed. Angela appeared in the doorway at 3:07, with the expression of someone who has been managing 6 simultaneous crises and has just encountered a 7th. "The Times wants a comment on the Robert Park development," she said. "Dana Whitfield specifically." "Not yet," Evelyn said. "She's going to run the story regardless." "I know. Tell her we'll have a statement by 5. We will." Angela nodded, then didn't move. "There's something else." Evelyn looked up. "Victor's attorney called the office 20 minutes ago," Angela said. "He asked to speak with you directly. Not with Thomas, not with the board, with you." Something in the room changed quality. Not physically. The temperature didn't shift. The light didn't move. But something atmospheric changed. The way it does when a conversation that has been approaching for a long time is suddenly right outside the door. "What did you tell him?" Evelyn asked. "That I've asked you." Evelyn put down her pen. She aligned it with the edge of the notepad. She thought about what it meant that Victor was reaching through his attorney rather than calling her himself. And she understood immediately that it meant he was afraid of the call being recorded, and that his attorney had told him so. It meant the attorney believed there was still something to protect. It meant they had looked at the day's developments. Robert Park, the additional documentation from Scarlett, the federal attorney's office involvement, and had recalculated what cooperation versus resistance was going to cost. "Call him back," Evelyn said. "Tell him I'll speak with Victor's attorney tomorrow morning at 9, in person, with Thomas present."
Angela wrote it down. Then she said, "Are you going to settle?" "No," Evelyn said, "but I'm going to let them think I might, long enough to find out what they're willing to give up to get there." Angela looked at her with an expression that Evelyn had seen growing over the course of the day. Not quite admiration, because Angela Chen was not a woman who performed admiration. Something more useful than admiration. Confidence. The confidence of one strategist recognizing another. 5 o'clock statement for Whitfield, Angela said. 5 o'clock, Evelyn confirmed. 4:48 p.m. 3 weeks later, Dana Whitfield would write a second long-form piece about Evelyn Sterling. And in researching it, she would speak with 14 people who had known Evelyn during the 6 months of preparation. What she would find, consistently, across all 14 accounts, was not the narrative of a woman consumed by revenge. What she would find was the narrative of a woman who had decided, with a very specific and difficult kind of discipline, to transform her anger into something that outlasted it. One of the accountants who had worked on the audit told her, "She never once asked me how bad it would look for him. She only ever asked me whether the numbers were right." A former colleague who had helped Evelyn reconnect with the board members said, "She was meticulous about not making it personal in the presentation. Every time I tried to frame it as a story about betrayal, she redirected me back to the institutional harm. She kept saying the same thing. The people who need to understand this are donors and investigators, not a divorce jury." Thomas Reeves, who had known Victor Sterling for 16 years before switching his professional loyalty to Evelyn, told Dana, "The most striking thing about her was that she was not trying to destroy him. She was trying to restore something. There is a difference. People who are trying to destroy something build toward a single moment. People who are trying to restore something build toward a structure that can stand after the moment passes." Everything she built was structural. Dana would put that quote near the end of her piece, but she thought about it first on the evening of the gala, sitting in her car outside the Imperial Crown Tower at 4:58 p.m., waiting for the 5 o'clock statement, watching the last few guests and most of the press filter out through the lobby doors. She thought about restoration versus destruction, and she looked up at the 42nd floor, where the ballroom lights were still on, and she thought, the woman up there understood something that most people in her position never figure out. The goal was never the night. The night was just the beginning. 5:31 p.m. The statement Evelyn released at 5 p.m. was 4 paragraphs. It confirmed Robert Park's resignation. It confirmed the expansion of the federal investigation to include additional documentation obtained that day. It confirmed the appointment of an independent audit committee that would begin work within the week. And it confirmed, in the final paragraph, that the Sterling Foundation would continue its programs without interruption, that no donor funds had been or would be redirected, and that the board remained committed to the institution's founding mission. It did not mention Victor by name. It did not mention Scarlett. It did not mention the gala, or the screens, or the midnight black gown, or any of the elements that had made the previous 12 hours the most discussed story in the city. It mentioned the foundation, the families the foundation served, and the work. Dana Whitfield read it in her car and said, out loud to nobody, "She's good." Then she filed her third piece of the day. 6 weeks later, the headline read, "Sterling Foundation completes independent audit. Former chair faces federal fraud charges." Victor Sterling had been formally charged on 19 counts: fraud, misappropriation of nonprofit funds, securities violations, and conspiracy. His attorney had attempted 3 separate preliminary negotiations with the federal attorney's office, each of which had been declined. The evidence was, as one legal analyst put it on national television, not a gray area. It was a fully documented, multiply verified, precisely time-stamped record of deliberate financial misconduct, spanning 4 years and involving 6 separate entities. There was not much to negotiate. The morning the charges were announced, Evelyn was in a meeting with the full board, 8 members now, Robert Park's seat not yet filled. The process for selecting his replacement underway, with the rigor that Evelyn had insisted every process receive. She learned about the charges from a text from Thomas, which she read during a 3-minute break, and she sat with it for those 3 minutes in a way that was not celebration and not relief, but something quieter and more complete. She thought, "It's done." Then she went back into the meeting. The board had questions about the audit findings. She answered them. The board had questions about the program funding timeline. She answered those too. Margaret Holloway raised a concern about donor confidence in the foundation's real estate holdings, given the Brooklyn situation. And Evelyn walked the board through the 3-point plan she and Angela had developed for addressing that concern, which involved a public real estate audit, an independent property management review, and a donor communication strategy that prioritized transparency over reassurance. "You're not trying to reassure them," Margaret observed. "You're trying to inform them." "Informed donors make better decisions than reassured ones," Evelyn said. "We don't need them to feel good about us. We need them to see clearly." Margaret nodded slowly. "Victor always tried to make people feel good about him," she said. "I know," Evelyn said. "That's how it went on for 4 years." 8 weeks later, Scarlett Hayes appeared before the federal grand jury in a closed session that lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. Her attorney, a woman she had hired on the recommendation of someone who was not Victor Sterling, had spent 6 weeks building a cooperation framework that the federal attorney's office had accepted in principle. The testimony Scarlett gave was specific, detailed, and damaging to Victor's case in ways that the documentary evidence alone could not have been, because Scarlett had been present in rooms that documents couldn't enter. She had heard conversations. She had been told things. She had watched a man construct a version of reality for her, specifically, with deliberate care, because she was the name on the accounts, and keeping her compliant was part of the architecture. She walked out of the federal building at 2:15 p.m. into a day that was cold and bright, and her attorney said, "You did well in there." "I told the truth," Scarlett said. "That's what doing well looks like in that room," her attorney said. Scarlett looked up at the sky for a moment. She was 26 years old, and she had aged in the last 2 months, in the way people age when something fundamental about how they understand the world has been revised. Not older in the way of years, older in the way of clarity. The particular maturity that comes not from experience, but from reckoning. She thought about the drive she had carried in her clutch all evening at the gala, the drive she had handed to Agent Cole 2 days later, in a second meeting she had requested, along with a complete written account of her knowledge of the accounts. She thought about the moment she had made that decision. Not at the gala, not in the hotel room after, but at 3 in the morning, sitting on the floor of the hotel bathroom with the drive in her hand, when she had finally asked herself a question that she had been avoiding for 14 months. Who do you want to be? Not who are you? Not who have you been? Who do you want to be, starting from this moment, with the choices that are still available to you? The answer had been clear. It had always been clear. She had just needed the floor to drop away before she was willing to look at it. "What now?" she asked her attorney. "Now," the attorney said, "you go back to being a financial analyst. You're 26 and you're good at math, and none of that has changed." Scarlett almost laughed. "It feels like everything has changed." "Everything that needed to," the attorney said. 4 months after the gala, the Sterling Foundation's annual report was released on a Tuesday morning, and it was, by every measurable standard, the most transparent document the Foundation had produced in its 23-year history. Full financial disclosure, independent audit certification, program outcome data broken down by neighborhood, school, and demographic. Real estate holdings listed at fair market value with independent appraisals attached. Board compensation disclosed. Executive compensation disclosed. Every line of income and every line of expenditure with a note explaining what it was and why it existed. Evelyn had written the letter from the chair herself. 3 drafts. She had rejected the first 2 because she could feel, reading them back, that they were still performing something. The first draft was performing accountability. The second was performing humility. The third draft was neither of those things. It was just true. The letter began. This foundation was built on a belief that is simple to say and hard to live. That the people who trust you with their money and their mission deserve to see exactly what you do with both. For a period that this report documents completely, that belief was not being honored. It is being honored now. It will be honored going forward, or it will not exist at all. Margaret Holloway read the letter at her kitchen table on Tuesday morning and called Evelyn at 8:15. "The letter is right," she said. "I know," Evelyn said. "Victor would have written 4 pages," Margaret said. "Beautiful language. You wrote 3 paragraphs." "The work is in the report," Evelyn said. "The letter just says what the report means." There was a pause, the kind of pause between 2 women who have been through something together and don't need to name it. "Are you happy?" Margaret asked. Evelyn thought about this seriously. She was at her desk in the Foundation offices, her permanent office now, not the temporary one. With the morning light coming through the window, she had come to know over 4 months of early arrivals and late departures. There was a photograph of Claire on her desk. There was a framed copy of the Foundation's original mission statement, written by hand, given to her by Margaret, the week she took the interim chairmanship. There was a coffee mug that her son Daniel had brought her 2 months ago, on the first visit he had made to her office, during which he had sat across from her and been very quiet for a long time, and then said, "I'm proud of you, Mom," in the specific, effortful way of a 24-year-old man who has not yet learned to say the important things easily. She had not cried then. She cried later, in the elevator, going down. She cried the way you cry when something you needed but had stopped expecting arrives, finally, without warning. "I'm not happy the way people expect," she told Margaret. "I'm not celebrating anything, but I'm where I'm supposed to be, doing work that matters, and I can look at myself in the mirror without negotiating. That's not exactly happiness. It's better than happiness. It's solid." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "That is better." 5 months after the gala, Victor Sterling entered a plea agreement on 11 of the 19 counts. The agreement included a financial settlement that returned $4.2 million to the Sterling Foundation's operating accounts, a lifetime ban from serving as an officer or director of any nonprofit organization, and a 5-year federal supervision arrangement whose terms were not fully disclosed to the public. He issued a 1-sentence statement through his attorney. "I accept responsibility for decisions that caused harm to the Foundation and to those it serves." 1 sentence. No detail. No beautiful language. No performance of contrition. Evelyn read it at her desk and thought about the 41 years he had spent filling rooms with his voice and his certainty, and his particular brand of magnificent, confident, costly dishonesty. And the fact that at the end of it, when the performance was finally over, there was only 1 sentence left. She thought, some people spend their whole lives building something that turns out to be a story about themselves. And when the story ends, There is nothing underneath it. She had been one of the props in that story for 23 years. She would not be a prop in anyone's story again. 6 months after the gala, on a Tuesday morning that looked, from the outside, exactly like any other Tuesday morning in a midtown office, Evelyn Sterling stood in front of the full foundation staff, 41 people, some of whom had been there since the beginning, and some of whom she had hired herself in the last 6 months. And she talked about the year ahead. The programs, the funding, the neighborhoods, the children in classrooms in 3 boroughs who were learning to read because someone had decided, decades ago, that it mattered, and had never stopped deciding it. She talked for 22 minutes. She did not talk about Victor. She did not talk about the gala, or the charges, or the documents on the screens, or the midnight black gown. She talked about the work, because the work was what had always been real, what had existed before the fraud, and through it, and after it, carried forward by the 41 people in front of her and the 4,000 families they served, none of whom had stopped needing the foundation simply because the man at its head had been corrupt. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then a program coordinator named Lewis, 29 years old, who had been with the foundation for 3 years and who had spent 2 months after the gala wondering if there would still be a foundation to work for, started clapping. The room followed. Evelyn stood at the front and let it happen, and did not look away from it, or minimize it, or perform the modest deflection of someone uncomfortable with being seen. She stood and received it, because she had earned it, and the people giving it had earned the ability to give it, and the whole transaction was honest, which made it the most valuable thing anyone had offered her in a very long time. Afterward, back in her office, Angela knocked and entered. "Good talk," she said. "Good team," Evelyn said. Angela sat across from her. She had a folder, because Angela always had a folder, but she didn't open it. She looked at Evelyn with the directness of a woman who does not use her words carelessly. "You know the hardest part is over," she said. "What comes next is still hard, but it's different hard. It's building hard." "Building hard is the only hard I know how to do," Evelyn said. Angela nodded once. She opened her folder. "Then let's talk about the Brooklyn properties." Evelyn picked up her pen. Because there was work to do. There would always be work to do. And Evelyn Sterling, who had walked into a ballroom 6 months ago with everything lined up and everything at stake, and 23 years of patience behind her, who had stood at a microphone and said what needed to be said and survived the saying of it, who had followed the truth even when it led to rooms she hadn't planned on entering and names she hadn't planned on confronting. Evelyn Sterling opened her notebook to the next clean page. And that was the real ending of the story. Not the charges, not the plea, not the headline or the photographs or the moment Victor Sterling's face changed on a stage in front of 700 people. The real ending was this: a woman at a desk with a pen in her hand and work in front of her, and the unqualified, unperformed, entirely private satisfaction of someone who chose, when it mattered most, to be exactly who she was. A queen does not reclaim a throne by rage. She reclaims it by becoming, undeniably and completely, the only person in the room who was ever truly fit to hold it.